given his reputation precedes him. Obviously very much a leading voice in the UK power industry, very experienced in terms of smart network edge technology, in terms of how that applies and where it's going. I think it's a bit of a framing statement. The UK is certainly a few years ahead of us. In New Zealand, we've got in many ways the luxury of having a high renewables base, 75–80%, which means we can afford to watch a little bit where things go in the UK and in the US and elsewhere, and then really pick the best and roll it in. So I'm sure John will be very illuminating in terms of what's happening in other jurisdictions, what we can take from it, and how we might think about our own future. So thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for your kind introduction. Great exaggeration, I'm sure. Now, I hope I don't give you indigestion. This is an unusual situation where I hope that there's a mix of things here where I can offer you the kind of things I'm seeing emerging in the UK. This week I've given a few presentations which have run close to death by PowerPoint, and the reason for that is there's so much stuff coming out of the UK at the moment, because big smart grid demonstration projects are now all producing their findings, and the Smart Grid Forum had a 2-hour webinar and we ran out of time. John Hancock will lead you to that stuff if you want to see that technical detail. What I'd like to cover here is something a bit different, and I think it very much resonates with what Lawrence was saying, and I very much endorse many of his sentiments. But let me just pause before I move on to say where this presentation came from. I've reworked the most recent presentation I gave in the UK, and this was to a group called the Westminster Energy Forum, and it's usually chaired by Lord somebody or other and all of that, where I felt I ought to try and give them a sort of strategic view of what was going on. And what it led me to was thinking, well, we do things in our businesses, sometimes we do things at the policy level, and sometimes it doesn't work out. It's okay, in a way. We learn from our mistakes, don't we? And if we're dealing with innovation, we should expect mistakes. I mean, if there aren't mistakes, it's probably not innovative. Where am I going with this? What I'm getting to is, I think, the criticism I really, really don't like to receive is the one that's encapsulated with too little too late. Too little too late suggests you kind of knew what was the right thing to do, but for whatever reason, you didn't do it at a scale which made the difference. And that was the message I was wanting to give to the Westminster group, but I've reshaped this to say, well, does some of this resonate for you, or might it help you avoid some pitfalls downstream? So a little bit of graffiti on the title would be, is it lost opportunities that we're facing, you see? Hence my introduction, so bearing with that. Okay, so first comment, and I offer this to, the view to the sector at large, internationally. Is there a risk of getting stuck in the weeds? And the real opportunities will start to pass us by. And I think there are 3 questions that I'd particularly like to just draw out today. Are we mobilising whole system thinking? Right? I would say the great majority of the real issues that I'm seeing, whether they're technical or commercial, all right, perhaps regulatory, they span the system. All right, they maybe even start reaching out into other sectors like communications and data, maybe other energy vectors, which we touched on just now. Right? And all of these things don't lend themselves to where, certainly speaking for the UK, we've got to after 80 odd years, which is 3 big silos of activity. All the transmission, distribution, and there are customers at the end. Right? And that simply won't, just won't cut it for the future. And we're seeing that in a number of places. Second question is going to be about, there's more than new technology going on. Right? There's lots of good new technology. It's really delivering benefits. But we're also beginning to see what I'd call the changes in the givens. And the givens are so established in our sector amongst the engineers that, well, they're not questioned anymore. Right? I'll come to that. And finally, are we as a sector beginning to engage with the rising complexities that are coming along and the possible societal reactions and impacts? So the risk in all of this is we have all the good ideas, but we end up with little delivered to customers in a few years' time. So what are the enablers? Are the hidden barriers? And how do policymakers and companies avoid ending up in a few years' time saying it was all too little too late, we didn't get it right? So just a couple of slides to summarise on smarter technologies. Sorry if you don't like the term smart, but it's got wide currency these days. And I think there are lots of upsides of moving to so-called smart technologies and edge technologies. Benefits to customers, I'll go through this quickly. New products and services, improved supply quality, but it does require customers to engage more in energy and energy services. So there's one hazard ahead. There are big pluses for networks, and this is being demonstrated with real practical network applications, lower cost solutions for connecting new customers, and interestingly, more flexibility, which is forms a strategy for managing uncertainty. Nobody knows when the electric vehicle tipping point is going to come, or whatever the other take-up challenges are. You don't want to start installing large plant, which has got a life of 40 years, and then find that the demand went somewhere else. The smart technologies are beginning to show real benefit in that they're quicker to install, cheaper to install, buys you a bit of time where you see what's going on, and you maybe never need that big reinforcement, or maybe you do. There are positives for wider society, I think, cleaner energy, perhaps resilience to storms, I know a big issue in the US. Community energy, I've talked quite a lot about this week. I think it's one of the big uncertainties and potentially very powerful, but it's not yet understood. And there should be jobs and exports behind all of this for sure. And finally, for network companies, DNOs as we would call them, is this smart world going to be an enabler for a DSO role? And Lawrence showed various sort of developments of network companies. It could provide the Internet of Things response as things get really censored and multi-vector, as it were, and it's certainly demonstrably good for attracting and retaining bright staff. It's an interesting one. It's not all upside though. There's a risk here with the smart technologies coming along, the edge technologies, really giving network problems, power network problems, excessive power flows, voltages out of limits. These things are actually happening, and you see them in the UK anyway, where there's a clustering. Right? So if there's a clustering of electric vehicles, or if every rooftop in a street has got solar panels, that's very different from one rooftop in the street. Right? So we've got situations where maybe a clustering effect has been caused by a social housing owner. So you've got a whole row of houses, they're probably all painted the same colour as well, and solar panels on every roof, and you're in serious issues about voltage rise early on bright summer mornings when there's no real demand, and that power has to be exported, and the system wasn't designed for reverse flow. Various issues here. The issues span T and D and users, and there's a big issue for another time about how do we coordinate all the automation. Most of these smart systems have to be automated, all right? It's using sensors, intelligent systems, but any systems engineer will say, well, you just need to be careful that they don't fight against each other. Right? That needs a lot of care because it's a whole system problem. There are network design risks here because of the long life nature of assets. So do we want to, for example, go on rolling out radial networks and perhaps tapering down to a smaller conductor at the end? Because if in a few years' time it looks really attractive to mesh the networks, you can't begin to close up the open points and operate it differently because you've got all these weak links of tapered network. So one tiny example. The other is what kind of assets do you install? Do you buy standard ring main units at 11 kV? Or one of our companies is doing, and Ofgem, our regulator's been happy with, is they spend a small increment more on smart ready ring main units. So you can add actuators, you can add sensors, but it's all built into the hardware. You know, just sort of sensible thing. And the last one, quite a big topic in its own right, I call it the getting stuck risk. Now, I know I tread on thin ice as I go into this question here. This is saying, at what point, you know, where is the balance between letting a free market go, you know, and let the companies buy the equipment they want, work with the vendors who look the most attractive to them, and at what point should there be some kind of standardisation or coordination? In any marketplace, you can see that if you're working with a vendor, the vendor will want to sell you their proprietary communication system, their proprietary protocol. So let's say, I don't know, Nissan Leaf works with all the Leaf owners here. Nissan says, oh, here's our charging post, we'll give you the software, that'll enable you to talk to our central database somewhere else in the world and give you benchmarking information. Everybody says, that sounds great. But we don't want to end up in a situation where Leaf owners can't drive onto the territory of Mitsubishi and use their charging points, as it were. And the usual answer in other sectors, open systems. We want interoperability. And interestingly, if a party, and it might be the government, it might be a regulator, calls the various vendor parties together, electric charging point, whatever, and says, we would like interoperable systems for EV charging, all those vendors will cooperate. All right? You don't have the government designing the open standard. The government is the facilitator of the meeting. And all the vendors will come and they will participate because they want to make sure that none of their features and their USPs are excluded from the agreed open protocol. Right? You can see this in other sectors, but it needs a little bit of care, and at what point do you step in with that kind of open systems? So the top one was about we are dealing with critical national infrastructure, so let's just be sure what we're doing. For the networks, assets going in today may be still operating in 2050. So let's make sure we're installing the right things. We've got some flexibility. And on the data and the interoperability and the open systems, I just say, whose job is it? Whose job is it to look for and ensure open systems, which are usually in customers' interest, and they almost inevitably are facilitators for innovation. Right? Small innovators would look into a country and say, oh, it's all bespoke systems now. How do I choose which garden to play in? I'm not going to any of those, and I'll go to a country where it's clearly open systems and I can play like anybody else. All I'd say is that the answer is who's responsible is no one, at least in the UK, and that's something we're grappling with. So, back to that first question. Are we mobilising whole system thinking? Well, I won't dwell on these, but I can point to some positive things in GB, and I've talked about some of these this week, and they're in the presentation. But the top one, National Grid in the UK has published its system operability framework, right? And it's revealing and setting out in very considerable detail the significant operational challenges on the GB transmission system today. Right? We're seeing reduction in inertia for those who are involved in these things, much more movement of the frequency, scarily so. We're seeing high voltages on the transmission system, which are outside National Grid's normal control levers to manage. And a couple of weeks ago, 419 kV on the 400 kV system for hours. The limit's 420. All right? Something fundamental is happening, and it's explored in that kind of document. The other two or three there are from our Smart Grid Forum in the UK, and the really good work is coming out of the work streams, and it is because they are stakeholder engaged, right? And overseen on a stakeholder basis. And talk later if you're interested, but our government has nodded its head and said, yep, we really want to understand more about this whole systems view. What's the alternative to silos? How do we manage kind of technical governance in a system that's set up for silos? And they are funding the Institution of Engineering Technology, where I've been involved as a kind of neutral party, to conduct a major project which is running at the moment. Say though, is that enough? You know, we've got all sorts of things going on, but I'd say, well, where is the leadership? You know, how does that really get pulled together? Is it a committee called Smart Grid Forum? meets every quarter. It's a useful body for overseeing stakeholder group, but I wouldn't say it was any leadership. Another problem that's emerging is we're relying very, very strongly on kind of volunteer effort and pro bono contributions. So this stuff going on through the IET, we're drawing on industry, deep knowledge, best practice, and it's a big challenge, and it's almost at the edge of what an institution can manage with voluntary support. And then finally, I've said I give credit to National Grid for publishing the SOF, the System Operability Framework, but I've also challenged them, and they haven't changed it this year because it's been republished last week. It isn't really a system operability framework, it's the transmission operability framework. Right? The system is everybody right there down to the last customer and beyond. Okay, we're still in kind of silo think there. That's taking place. My last comment at the bottom, which I've just added, is where do you go for whole system knowledge? How would time of use charging for electric vehicles, reaching a tipping point on price, all the vehicles charge at the same time, that's going to affect the distribution network, the transmission network, the national balancing, the market. Who has that knowledge? And it's a shrinking number of people. Okay, second of the three questions was, are the changes to the givens being thought about? And another way of phrasing this question is, does a fish know it's wet? Deep philosophical point. But you know, when you're completely immersed in something, do you know, or are you aware, kind of even where you are, which I think is where we are in the power industry very often. So this is half of my list. I've got another slide, double the number. Demand is something that can be predicted. Yes, we've been doing it for years. We understand the impact of weather and the time of the year. Demand can be predicted. Diversity reduces demand. Consumers have locations. No, they don't if they're not electric vehicles. If they're electric vehicles. Plant ratings are seasonal numbers, winter ratings, summer ratings. Is that true? If you've got real-time rating? Short circuits cause fault current. No, they don't if you're buffered by power electronics. Control engineers are in the loop. Always been the case. Kieran's smiling at me here. I'm going to make a case in a moment that the way we're going is they can't possibly be in the loop in the future. 20 minutes is a good time horizon. Right? That's kind of where engineers come from. That's kind of the time it takes for electrical things to heat up or sag down or the temperature to go up and give a problem. The way we're moving, there will not be 20 minutes. Okay. Forecasting looks forward. Doesn't if you're thinking about storage. Right? Because you've got to look back and see the status of the storage and the patterns and the historical patterns of the storage, and so on. Forgive me for the one from the bottom, but it's very true where I come from. Europe is somewhere else. Now, I'd like to just take that first one. Demand is something that can be predicted. Demand curves. If I gave you a felt tip pen, I guess you could all draw some kind of New Zealand demand curve. The demand comes up in the morning, it's probably plateau today, and in the winter, perhaps it rises up a bit at the end of the day. Yeah? So these are recent GB demand curves. So the winter one, summer one, that's one day, up to 50,000 megawatts GB demand. Okay? So that peak occurs in winter, but not in summer. Now these are so given that they are completely taken for granted, and they're the basis of almost all the investment decisions and many of the market mechanisms. Just before we move on, I did manage to find demand curves for 1935, and that's a significant year because it's the year that the small localised grids that were owned by cities, one night when everything was quiet and everything was running, this wouldn't happen these days, the control engineers in the then Central Electricity Board said, what would happen if we joined all these places up and ran as one national system? And they did. It was stable, fortunately, and it's never been disconnected. Now, that was in 1937, I think. I think this is quite interesting because the total is not bad. The scale is completely different if you look at the number of megawatts. Okay, but the shape is remarkably similar. And the other thing that you can pick out from here is that it appears that industry shut down for lunch. Yeah. Okay, so let's just go a bit further. Having got that kind of demand curve in mind, imagine 4 days. Right? 4 days. So the line at the top is the traditional demand curve for 4 typical days. Okay, and we then stir in. It says in the small print, but 20% wind or something like that. So it's random wind. Okay, stirred into there. And then the red is the conventional generation without that wind. So instead of the red following the black at the top directly, it's displaced by wind, and that varies depending on the day of the week and the weather conditions. But if you then say, well, hang on, the conventional plant, in simple terms, is probably setting the marginal price in the market because the wind generation's got 0 marginal cost. Would it be sensible, and if you can see now there's a green line built onto the red line, which says we'll introduce time of use tariffs by whatever logic, which will trim the peaks and fill the troughs. Okay? And that's what the green line does on there. Okay? Led by some kind of time of use tariff. But the interesting thing then is if you just clean out those lines, you find that the dark line, the underlying original load curve, becomes the blue line. All right? The demand curve has become the blue line. And I'd suggest that if you look at that blue line, to the human eye, it would look random. Right? It really does. Now here is something which absolutely underpinned the whole sector, now is becoming a random line. Okay. That's without adding solar PV and a few other unknowns. So, you know, why have the demand curves been important? Well, because we've known the peak, we've known about the minimum, we know about the plateau, and importantly for generation scheduling, we know about the ramp rate. Okay? And it's all been predictable by all the parties in the supply chain, from the generators through to the suppliers, retailers. Peak demands usually determine network capacity. Minimum demands are key to voltages and voltage control, but also determining your maintenance windows and your construction opportunities. Plateau demands sometimes actually set peak flows on the network. Ramp rates for generation scheduling. And then in the UK anyway, before we had any idea of smart meters, all of our domestic customers are on representative demand profiles. Well, hang on, what's a profile? It's a load curve. And also, it's that load shape which has allowed the industry to have cyclic plant ratings. Where things heat up and cool down. What's going to happen if the blue line is driving the loading? So, which way does this go? I think entirely new analytics needed, right? And this is where we need to, again, reach out from our traditional sector into the world of big data and some very good mathematical treatment. It will need extensive sources of new data to start to build these demand curves. Right? And to do forecasting. And if you can't do forecasting, how do you optimize storage? Right? Lawrence was talking about the rise of storage, makes a lot of sense, but when do you charge it and when do you discharge it? You can only do that by clever algorithms. And what will the algorithms assume of the state of the system going forward? So it's big data issues in here. If we're moving a lot of data around for different parties to use in their modelling or their operations or the control room, are those going to be under bespoke protocols from different parts of the sector? Or are we going to get a grip on this and say this is really important, it's an enabler for change and we want interoperable systems? Okay. And this does point to much more of a whole system challenge beyond the semi-manual controls, the control rooms today. Let me just complete with the third question, the rising complexities. In the UK, there are a number of good things going on. The projects I talked about before, Ofgem has consulted on NTBMs. We have a new acronym, non-traditional business models, which is all good. And the Smart Grid Forum is producing a lot of insightful work about where we're going. I think what I see in NZ when I pop in and out is a lot of good things happening through the Smart Grid Forum, and I think if you get the Smart Technology Working Group, you'll have some really good platforms for a lot of these issues. But is it enough? You know, there is a huge way to go. We're so early on the curve here, and if we start to get that dialogue that Lawrence was talking about, do we then abandon the organisation that caused that dialogue to come together and start all over again in 6 months' time? Right? There's just a kind of institutional thing here about continuity, quite difficult. Does the leadership, wherever that's coming from, need to step up a gear? And then, how do we address and respond to actions? Because there's a lot of new stuff here. It could be cybersecurity, data analytics, power engineering. Do you go out to consultants and get some good work done? But if you do, where's the knowledge gone? It's gone to the consultants, right? And the stuff we're talking about here, leave a thought with you, they are not projects. You know, it's not that you want it fixed and solved and well, that's now done. Almost everything we're talking about, we're just producing version 1 of something. Right? So there's going to be a real need to be able to pick up, develop, firmware downloads, upgrade software. Where's the knowledge going to be if it was all done by consultants and vendors? And my last little bit is saying there seem to be some new societal trends appearing. My last couple of slides now. First one is saying there's some evidence that perhaps society in places is getting a bit uneasy with smart. You know, you've got the Internet of Things talked about, programmable world, lots of data about us and what we're doing and our preferences and so on. But there's a phrase that goes with this, which is digital tethering. How many of you have had a subtle glance to see if you've had any emails while you've been here? Right? You are digitally tethered. You're behaving more like a subtly programmed computer. Right? I'm guilty of it too. Julie Cohen in the US said, citizens are losing their breathing room. Time when you're not feeling you're being chased by somebody, watched by somebody, or something vibrating in your pocket. You really ought to think about that. Losing the time to mull things over. Turing, if you remember, you know, there's the Turing test that says when do you tell when a computer is behaving like a human being? But there's a kind of reverse Turing test here, which says, well, when are we as human beings beginning to behave like computers? As we're being nudged and twisted and levered into this digital tethering. People might react against that. So is there a level of threat to societal unease that could be, if we're not careful, a barrier to smart systems? I said there were two. The other one is smart, in fact, getting a bit beyond society. But this is Steve Case from AOL. The pace of innovation continues to accelerate and outstrip the ability of governments to react. Neelie Kroes, who's in the European Commission, this is my biggest frustration in the Commission. The changes in technology nowadays are so fast. Okay. You could say the internet, which now influences all sorts of things like security, territorial arrangements, all this kind of stuff, is really the agenda of governments. But no governments have been involved in the internet. Maybe a good thing. By contrast, though, just look back to the Industrial Revolution. Things moved more slowly. They were more understandable. Certainly speaking for the UK, good things happened actually through our Parliament, the Truck Act, and rights of, for land ownership and things sorted out to be enablers. But the government could kind of follow what's going on. I'd suggest now, well, speaking for the UK, our government departments really, really struggle to retain any depth of knowledge in these areas. So power is migrating to impersonal processes. All I'd say is that whatever the way forward, it would appear that society needs its technologists to be more actively engaged alongside other policy professionals. But that requires the technologists to be better communicators, because if the technologists don't engage, I think we can be pretty sure that there'll be a gap that's filled by pundits and conspiracy theorists. And you see it in the media. Okay? Completely the wrong end of the stick, but it makes a good story. So I just leave a question at the bottom. Are the engagement skills of our technologists up to the job? And as an engineer, I'd say, not necessarily, no, not. perhaps we could do something about that. So, sorry, it's probably slightly overstepped the time, but
John, plenty of time for maybe 2 questions.
a couple of questions if there's anything there.
John, I have a question.
Yes.
So a lot of your discussion around holistic thinking assumes holistic information sharing.
Very often.
Yes, and so we've unbundled and unbundled.
Yeah.
What is the incentive? How do you put it all back together? Because what you're asking for is for the distribution company, the consumer, for that information to be able to flow upwards and downwards. So you have data privacy issues, you have information sharing issues. How do we put this back together from a regulatory standpoint?
That's a really good question. Take the example of electric vehicle charging. The European Commission, to its credit, has issued a mandate and said for the 28 member states, whatever it is, you should be able to drive your vehicle anywhere in Europe and know you can plug it in and charge it and pay. Okay? It's a real headache. It's brought all the European standards bodies together, and it won't be quick. But at least somebody has shown some leadership and said, in this area, we want it interoperable. Now, interoperability is very well understood in the comms industry and elsewhere, but it's almost an alien concept in power, and it gets confused with central planning or renationalisation. Completely the wrong end of the stick again. But if you've got a segmented industry, it's your question, and then you say, yeah, everybody agrees that a bit of open systems would be good, which party is going to take that on? You know? It's no one party's job. Other sectors would say, oh, that's the role of what they would call a system architect or some role like that. Right? And the architect doesn't own any of the assets, but is accountable for making sure all the bits talk to each other and hammering out standards. And if you're maintaining a modern airliner and you're bringing Rolls-Royce bringing a new engine in, the first thing they do is, as well as talk to the project scheduling people, they'll talk to the system architect for the project. So at the end, the engine works, but the engine talks to the cockpit, and the engine talks to the fuel tanks, all of that joined up stuff, whole system stuff, is overseen by the system architect, who doesn't own the assets and isn't a chief engineer, if I could say that 2 or 3 times.
Is New Zealand large enough to develop standards, or are we best trying to piggyback off an emerging global standard?
Yeah. And from what I've been seeing, and from the work that's been done with the transform model through the Smart Grid Forum and so on, suggests that you've maybe got a kind of 5-year window, fortunately, before you start going around the tipping points of various technologies. It could change, but if you've got a breathing space, that is great. But I would also say that there's a kind of glib statement that says, oh, that's all right, we're fast followers. That's our philosophy. We're fast followers, so we keep on track on what's going on, and then when the right thing comes along, we're off and running. My experience in the power system is that wherever that's been applied, it's failed. Right? And if you say, you've got a traditional company who now are going to introduce this technology because it's reached a certain availability, you'll get it installed, you'll get it commissioned, and I'd almost guarantee within a year it'll somehow be switched out. All right? And I would leave this as a thought with you. I think you've got 4 or 5 years, but it's so valuable to start mobilising thinking. It's what understanding was there of that product and how it was bought in your procurement department? Have your legal department ever had a contract with a university or a small startup company? Or are they going to ask the small startup company for $1 million bond or something? You know, it's all right, it's Alstom, no problem. But
why are you pointing to me?
Well, somebody who's not there. But yes, I think there are fundamental issues here. So demonstration projects, all right, it's really, really helpful because you just learn so much. All right, but I would say, and it was a phrase on one of those slides that I didn't elaborate, people don't engage in innovation unless there's some jam in it. Okay? It shouldn't be excessive, all right? But if it's all risk and if it's all downside, well, you might get 1 or 2 people doing 1 or 2 things to show willing, never take off. All right? There has to be some jam in it, especially if you want people to put themselves out and do things afresh.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Just a couple of things I took from the discussion. I think I like listening to John because he always knows what questions to ask and where the issues are. And the advantage I think we have in New Zealand, and I think you're right, we shouldn't just sit back and say, we'll wait 5 years, see what happens, but there are big economies, both in the UK, US, around the world, wrestling with these broader questions, and very smart people started to unpick them and unlock them. So I think as long as we collectively stay tuned into that discussion and pick the very best answers, we've got a good chance of repositioning. So thank you for your time, thank you for kind of flagging some of the things we should be actively thinking about and actively debating amongst ourselves. I did like the plug for our Smart Grid Forum and the Smart Technology Working Group in ENA. I think that is at least it's a central point to start to have some of these discussions, and hopefully we can involve the broader kind of community around those forums. So thank you, John. For good to have a final clap for Lawrence, both Lawrence and John for taking it.